Hello and welcome to Tech Deals. 8 generations of Intel i7 CPUs benchmarked and compared gaming and non-gaming performance. I have footage from the benchmarks to show you in just a few minutes. I'll voice that over. Real-time performance numbers on the screen as well as lots of benchmark charts. We are testing 4 different i7s to represent the various generations because many of them were very similar. You can see 3 fully built computers here, all of which have had an appearance on my channel at some point in the past. And then my standard test bench in front of me, which we'll start with because it has the i7 9700K, 8 cores, 8 threads. It's the newest and greatest until the next newest and greatest from Intel comes out. Now, the purpose of this video is not necessarily to say you should buy any one of these particular chips, but more to represent how much performance boost is there today in 2019 between the different generations. When a new generation comes out, often software doesn't use it very well, programs aren't necessarily adapted to the latest instruction techniques, the fastest DDR memory, and other things, and so there doesn't seem to be a very large performance jump. But looking back in time, looking back to the past 8 years, have we actually seen gaps in performance appear between the generations on modern software using modern games and modern productivity applications in 2019 across all of these generations? There will be an upcoming comparison with the i7 9700K and the new Ryzen 7 3700X, as well as the i9 9900K and the Ryzen 9 3900X. That might be the very next video coming up after this, but for the moment, we're just focusing on the i7s and a generational comparison to see what you really get from upgrading. I have a feeling there are a ton of you out there that have 2nd or 4th generation i7s and you've been holding off on upgrading, and maybe the 1st or 2nd gen of Ryzen didn't bait you at upgrading. The price of the i9 made you go, whoa, $500, I think I'll wait for a little bit. And you're sitting on the sidelines wondering, is there a performance improvement? We're going to take a look at the first half of that equation today, looking at the new i7 9700K. And then you'll be able to take these results and in the next video, look at all 4 of the brand new top-end chips and then see what you want to do. Either upgrade now, or perhaps you're happy enough with your performance and you want to wait 1 more year. One of the reasons to make this video is in fact my aforementioned comment regarding small performance improvements over the years. If you were watching the tech news, reading the tech blogs, and following on YouTube over the past 8 years, you may have seen the i7 3770K come out, and then the i7 4770K, and then all the way up to the 7700K. 4 cores, 8 threads, all of them, at least until the 8th generation, which changed. And you may very well say, man, there was never any really difference. They're all pretty much the same. 4 cores, 8 threads. If you get the clock speeds about the same, then there's no real difference. That's why, for this test, all 3 of these machines are at 4.5 gigahertz fixed clock speed. This right here is the i7 7700K, 4 cores, 8 threads, 7th generation Kaby Lake, running at 4.5 gigahertz. The one in the middle, which you've only seen a little bit on the channel, this actually had a full build, but this is the i7 4790K Haswell refresh from 2014. Again, 4 cores, 8 threads, 4.5 gigahertz on all the cores and threads, no turbo up or down or anything else. And then finally, over on the far side of the screen, there's a video of that being rebuilt on the channel. That's not the case that it was in, but I've owned that i7 2600K, or rather the motherboard and system since new. It originally had an i5 2500K, but I did a rebuild into that Be Quiet case, and oh my lord, their name is correct. That case is really nice. 4.5 gigahertz runs very nicely on the 2600K. And so all 3 of these machines are standardized at that 4.5 gigahertz speed. Yes, they will run a little bit over that, but at 4.5, basically everybody who owns these machines should be able to get that with reasonable cooling. Now, I'll be honest here, the i7 9700K would be silly at 4.5. That is almost a down clock to some extent. This is running at 5 gigahertz. The new 9th generation chips are soldered. This is a Noctua NHD15 $90 tower cooler. No issues whatsoever, 5 gigahertz on all 8 cores. Even in AIDA64 stress testing, it struggled to even hit 70 degrees. It ran cool and quiet and had no issues at stock voltage settings whatsoever. So the new one is at 5 gigahertz, but in fairness, if you're going to buy a new one, you will run it at 5 gigahertz. You're crazy not to. You just type in a 50 in the BIOS for the multiplier, put a decent cooler on it such as this Noctua, or a Dark Rock Pro 4 would also be fine, and you'll get 5 gigahertz without any issue whatsoever. That's not necessarily true on these. They're hit and miss trying to get above 4.5. The RAM configuration is necessarily different between each of these machines because they don't support the same types of RAM. The i7 9700K here and the i7 7700K used exactly the same memory sticks, 32 gigabytes of DDR4 3200 CL16. You don't need 32 gigs to run most games these days. It's nice future-proofing if you're building a new machine, but it simply removes RAM as an equation, allows the benchmarks to run at their best ability. Now, the i7 4790K here doesn't support DDR4, so it had 32 gigabytes of DDR3 2400, and then the i7 2600K had 32 gigs of DDR3 2133. Try as I might, my i7 2600K would not run at 2400. I have 3 different 2400 memory kits. None of them would do it. Maybe it's that board's limitation. It's got a setting for 2400, but it would not do it. And I didn't want to handicap the 4790K because I think a lot of 4790Ks were set up with 2400. So there is a small, not a big difference, but there is a small RAM speed difference between the 4th gen and the 2nd gen. And of course, obviously the 2 newer machines have the benefit of DDR4, but that's part of the overall platform improvement and part of the upgrade process. All of these machines boot to an SSD and ran all of the benchmarks off of SSDs, and all of the Windows installs were clean, fresh installs of Windows 10 version 1903. None of these have been just updated and patched over the years. Even my older machines all got fresh, clean installs. The driver versions were all the same and up to date. These were all tested in the same week, so everything was exactly the same. All the BIOSes are as up to date as all the various manufacturers offer. Yes, all the latest Spectre and Meltdown security patches are applied. And then we had the same video card in all the machines. You can see here, it's the Asus ROG Strix RTX 2080 Ti. Now, it's a great video card for a modern high-end i7 9700K, maybe a little overkill for an older machine, but it removes graphics as much as possible from the equation. Now, we tested at 1080p high detail, which again, you aren't buying a $1,200 graphics card. This is not a graphics card comparison, this is a CPU comparison. How much raw CPU performance difference is there between these 4 processors? We take the graphics out of the equation, we put plenty of RAM on, we put great SSDs in all of them. We have NVMe drives, by the way, for those of you curious. Even the 4790K got a Intel 660p NVMe, great drive, by the way. SATA in the 2600K because it doesn't support NVMe. But I tried to remove all the bottlenecks and make them run as well as possible to give every CPU basically the best chance to shine and show you what the true performance difference is between these different generations of chips. Why don't we look at some game benchmarks? I'm going to put 4 on the screen at one time. On the top is going to be the 2600K and the 4790K, and on the bottom will be the 2 newer platforms. You'll see the labels on the screen. Real-time numbers are provided by MSI Afterburner. It was used for some of the benchmarks here. Others use the game's built-in benchmarks in order to get the numbers you're about to see in the charts. The actual footage you're watching is the benchmark runs that you're going to see in the numbers, but I used an external hardware capture card to record the footage, so there's no performance lost from recording the video footage you're about to see. That was done on a separate computer. And then after that, I'll show you non-gaming benchmarks. First up, we have Assassin's Creed Odyssey, and this game is very demanding, partly because it's graphically intensive and partly because Ubisoft optimization. Although that's not totally fair because The Division 2 is also Ubisoft and it actually runs quite well. In the upper left-hand corner, you can see the i7 2600K running just over 60 frames per second, and in the bottom right-hand corner, you can see the i7 9700K doing nearly 120 frames per second. Lots of people love to say that there's very little difference in i7s over the generations, but last time I checked, 60-ish to 120 is nearly double the performance. That's not bad, all things considered. Although notice the total CPU usage on all of these chips, we are in fact using almost all 8 threads or 8 cores on these processors. As far as performance, I'm going to change the charts around a little bit. You can see I'm doing one chart per game rather than splitting them out, so you can see the average, minimum, and maximum frame rates on a single chart per game. 71 frames per second average on the i7 2600K, not bad all things considered, versus 120 frames per second on the i7 9700K. Since these are all 8-thread processors, yes, those extra cores do make a difference, but the optimizations and improvements over the years, faster RAM, faster bus speeds, it all does slowly make a difference. And you can see a very smooth stair-step ladder. The minimum frame rates in this game are very hard to reproduce, so the average frame rates are the ones that really matter. Dawn of War 3 is next. Now this won't be as long. In fact, I'll change the length of each of the benchmarks depending upon how much I have to say. This one is pretty straightforward. Obviously, there's a performance difference between the chips. The core and thread usage is not as high as it was in Assassin's Creed Odyssey, which is a good example of how not every game needs maximum cores and threads. It does vary depending upon what you're going to play. 102 frames per second average on the i7 2600K and slowly working our way up to 155 frames per second on the modern processor. It is, of course, completely playable on all 4 chips. It's just how much performance, how much potential performance, or how much reserve performance do you want? Mankind Divided, not a new game, but very demanding to run. Take a look at the performance. We're at 115 frames per second on the newest chip, 75 on the oldest. Severely CPU bottlenecked here. Now, crank up the graphics and resolution, and of course it won't be as bottlenecked, but there is a substantial performance difference. It's sort of the tale of two stories, and I'll talk about that towards the end of the video. But you can both say that the new i7 is amazing, but the old i7 isn't bad either. 92 frames per second average on the 2600K versus 144 frames per second on the 9700K. F1 2018 is not that hard of a game to play, even though it's relatively recent. You can see from the frame rates here, it's ridiculously fast. But this may very well be the kind of game you want, either 144 or maybe even up to 240 frames per second for ultra smooth gameplay. Perhaps you're playing it with a serious rig, a steering wheel, even a stick shift and pedals, and you're just a super gamer with this. You got a 240 hertz monitor. That may not be most of you, but the bottom 2 CPUs can do it. 189 on the average on the 2600K, 274 on the 9700K. Holy smokes. From a percentage jump and a total number difference, that's impressive. In the real world, does it matter for most of you? No, probably not. Far Cry 5, a very intensive game that demonstrates several key points. Number 1, even with a 5 GHz i7 9700K, we are severely CPU bottlenecked. We are running 70 to 80% usage on our graphics card on the RTX 2080 Ti on the bottom right-hand corner. And while that's not great, it beats the pants off the 2600K. Look at that. We are getting between 40 to 50% graphics card usage on the 8-year-old i7 2600K, even at 4.5 gigahertz, because that CPU just can't deliver the geometry, the detail, the in-game effects, and everything else going on in order to keep up with the graphics card. So putting a 2080 Ti to play at 1080p is kind of silly, in fact, frankly, on most of these games. Now, taking a look at the performance here, 98 frames per second is still really good on that 2600K. Cut the graphics card level in half with an RTX 2060, and it would actually still run about that speed. The i7 9700K, of course, did 155 frames per second, and truth be told, if you want to play modern games on a 144 hertz monitor, no matter what graphics card you buy, you really do need a modern CPU to do that. Far Cry New Dawn is the follow-up standalone full-price DLC to Far Cry 5. I'm including it, well, partly because it's the newest game. I'll drop Far Cry 5 here at some point, probably within a couple of months. But it's worth noting that the performance in Far Cry New Dawn is lower than Far Cry 5. And Far Cry 6 and whatever comes else will be lower. Are you buying a CPU that runs today's games? and only today's games, or do you want a CPU that will handle the next 3 to 5 years of games? Now, if you already own a CPU, that's a separate question. Do you upgrade now or do you upgrade later? But if you're contemplating a new purchase, this is why I recommend you buy all the CPU you can afford. You'll grow into it. Here we are at 90 frames per second on the 2600K. That is 8 frames per second slower than Far Cry 5. 137 on the 9700K versus 155 in Far Cry 5. So there is a reasonable drop in performance there for the new game with the new effects and obviously a different built-in benchmark. But as I was saying, if you want some future-proofing in front of you, if you're going to go out and make a new purchase today, buy as much as you can reasonably afford. If you don't need all of it today, you'll grow into it over time. Final Fantasy 15, the wonderfully notorious built-in benchmark that I am aware of the issues of using it for graphics card comparisons, but we're not doing that today. We're using CPU comparisons, so it works well enough. One interesting thing that I find fascinating, take a look at the CPU usage. On the older i7s, notice that they're all above 50%, in fact 80% in places, but the i7 9700K is quite a bit lower. Notice that we are actually finally graphics card bound to some extent on the bottom two CPUs. Those are running at 96, 98, 97%. It's not 100% of the time, and it's not all the time. But when you look at the chart here in just a second, I want you to keep in mind that there are places in this benchmark that did bump into a graphics card bottleneck. Even at 1080p, even at only high detail, on a $1,200 graphics card, we were graphics card bottlenecked at 1080p on an i7 9700K. And to some extent, on a 7700K, which is why you see a bit of a compression in these numbers. Now remember, this is about a 6-minute benchmark, and I showed you about 40 seconds or so, but I benchmarked the entire thing. I didn't just benchmark the 40 seconds. So what you're seeing here is a result of the entire thing, and we are graphics card bound even with an RTX 2080 Ti. That's crazy. Let me know in the comments below if you want For Honor included in future benchmarks. This is getting ridiculous. Unless we go down to more entry-level graphics cards, the frame rate and the optimization on this thing is so ridiculously good. What are we really testing and benchmarking here? We're over 200 frames per second on all of these, and we're either graphics card bound or engine bound. The thing just isn't going to run any faster. So as much fun as it is to continue to test, look how pretty that is. All games should be this optimized. Newsflash to everybody listening. Please optimize your games this well. That is an incredible amount of performance for all those trees and elements going on. Here you can see the performance on the screen. I won't even bother reading it to you. It's amazing and incredible. This game may be better reserved for, say, $100 to $200 graphics card testing, or should you upgrade your graphics card? If we were testing the GTX 480, yes, I said 480, that was the then current best NVIDIA card when the i7 2600K came out, we'd probably actually, this would make sense doing. But on an RTX 2080 Ti, it's kind of silly. Forza Horizon 4, the absolutely gorgeous game that just got a huge mega update at E3. Lego Racers is in there now, and of course I have 3 kids, so I think that's cool. If the rest of you don't, that's okay too. No MSI Afterburner overlay because, well, it's just not supported, and despite changing all the settings, it doesn't really make any difference. So I won't show you very much of it because there's not really much to watch here. Instead, let's go look at the benchmark. We do have a little bit more GPU bottlenecking here. You can see the drop off as we go up the curve. 152 to 160 to 164 is not a large jump. Forza Horizon 4 is a very GPU intensive game, and frankly, when we do graphics card comparisons, it'll be a great one to test. But for here, you're not seeing a big huge difference because it's getting pretty much all it can out of that graphics card. Ghost Recon Wildlands, one of my favorite games of the past couple of years. Those of you who've watched my videos, you've heard me say that many times. Because I have played this game to completion and beaten it and live streamed it and covered it numerous times, I can speak about it in a level of detail I can't always do so on every single game.
This game runs fine on an i7-2600K. It really does. I played it on, I actually ran through and did a couple of random missions, blowing up some convoys and some fun stuff. I will tell you that it is smoother and nicer on the modern machines. A 7700K is fine. The 4790K was okay. It was certainly better than the 2600K. But this is one of those games that really likes a modern platform with good fast memory and good fast processors because there's so much going on in an open world game. 105 to 156 on the performance. But this does not really reflect the real-world gameplay as much. Open-world games, built-in benchmarks don't do as good of a job. We'll talk about that more in the Division 2 when we show that here in a minute. But I can tell you that the minimums you see here of 94 frames per second won't be that good when you're out doing a lot of shooting up and activities and stuff going on in the open world. The 4790K is okay. It's not nearly as bad. And if you got I would play this on a 4790K. I would do all I could to avoid playing it on a 2600K. I know those don't seem like a huge difference to a lot of you, but they really, really are. And I'll talk about that in recommendations at the end of the video. Grand Theft Auto 5 included because, well, so many of you still keep playing it, and I think a lot of us are eagerly anticipating a Grand Theft Auto 6. This game looks better than its age would imply. It runs fine. As much as I say, no, upgrade, well, you know what? This game came out in an era where that i7-2600K was fine. And while it certainly is slower than the others, we're deeply, deeply CPU bound on all of these computers. So forget the graphics card. You don't need an RTX 2080 Ti. Heck, you wouldn't need an RTX 2080 Ti to play this at 4K these days. So yeah, it's faster on the modern machines because the CPUs are faster, but do you really need 135 frames per second in GTA 5? Well, if you do, well, then you'll need better than a 2600K because it won't do it. But the 9900K, the 9700K certainly will. 101 to 108 to 127 to 144. Very good performance. Metro Exodus. I am aware that the game's built-in benchmark is, in some regards, more challenging than the game itself. I've had several people give me that feedback. Thank you. This is not a game I've played to completion, so I can't talk about the different areas in great detail, but I do listen to the feedback. That's what that comment section is down there for. Take a look at how close the 4790K and the 7700K are. They aren't far apart. The 9700K is, of course, a little bit further ahead, but there is a substantial performance difference when you drop off to that 2600K. And again, as I said, I'll discuss that in recommendations at the end of the video. Use what you've got, use what you can afford, but there is a very real performance difference even just between the two generations of 2600K and 4790K. I will also take this opportunity, and this is a test to see who's watching the entire video, because I didn't discuss it as much as I meant to when I filmed the on-camera parts. The i7-3770K is identical in performance at the same clocks to the 2600K, and the i7-6700K is identical in performance at the same clocks to the 7700K. That's why they're not here. There's no point in including them. The 3770K was just a 22 nanometer die shrink Ivy Bridge over Sandy Bridge. They work in the same motherboards. And the 6700K was Skylake, whereas the 7700K was KB Lake, which really should have been called Skylake Refresh. It was just an optimized process refresh. They were both 14 nanometers, so very little difference there. 92 to 109 to 116 to 124. There's a little bit of graphics card bottlenecking going on there at the top, but not a ton. It certainly is using those cores and threads modern games do. And as we look forward from 2019 going forward, 8 cores or 8 threads is going to be a limit. So again, recommendations in a minute. Take a look at those minimums. That's pretty brutal. We did not hold 60 frames per second on the bottom 2 processors. It was close, but we didn't. And just barely on the other 2. Rainbow Six Siege continues to be a popular online game for Twitch streamers and competitive gamers. The game's built-in benchmark is very easy to run. The live game is much more difficult. So take that into consideration when you are looking at these numbers. The performance delta and gap here is substantial. If you are legitimately playing at 240 hertz and you want to hold 240 frames per second, you need all the computer because it really will fall off in the game. If you're a casual player, actually a 2600K would be just fine. Even if you take 50% off of these numbers, the performance is just fine for most people. But again, if you're a competitive gamer with a serious gaming monitor, then yeah, you want to be on the new platform. Shadow of the Tomb Raider. This is where I give the speech that says 8 cores or 8 threads will not be enough going forward. This game, and in fact most of these games, came out last year in 2018. We are in the summer of 2019 as I record this. We are 18 months away from the PlayStation 5 and Xbox Scarlet, whatever they end up naming it, which will have 8 cores and 16 threads of Zen 2 processor. Games are going to 8-core 16-thread as the mainstream. This is why, as I'm going to say in the recommendations in a minute, I would not buy an i7 9700K. Buy the i9, buy the Ryzen 7. And I'm actually going to go ahead and rewind that. I want to show this to you again because I really want this point to be heard. Look at the i7 9700K. We are using 80 to 90% of that CPU. If you go out and buy this processor today, right now, in games released now, and in fact, a lot of games that'll be released over the next year, your CPU is going to max. There's 100% we just hit on the 9700K. Why would you go buy a brand new CPU right this second just so it's immediately maxed out and you have no room to grow whatsoever? And with the new consoles coming with 16 threads in 18 months, there's no future in that chip. Seriously, folks, buy an i9 or buy the Ryzen 7 3700X, or if you have the money for an i9, buy a Ryzen 9 3900X and get 12 cores, 24 threads. It is, by the way, not necessarily a matter of just lowering graphics detail and accepting a lower frame rate. It's worth noting that if the CPU cannot consistently generate the world that you're in, you won't get slower frame rates, you'll get stutter, you'll get frame skipping, you'll get jitteriness. That's what's going to happen when you run out of cores and threads, not lower frame rates. Lack of graphics card causes lower frame rates. Lack of cores and threads causes stutter. In any case, 95 frames per second on the 2600K versus 160 on the 9700K. That is a substantial difference. Steep, the downhill skiing death simulator. Wait, that's not it. Well, this is a fun little game that I've played around with a little bit. I'm honestly not very good at it. I just tried playing through the first mission. It is fun, although my hand-eye coordination is not quite as good as it used to be. I have the sneaking suspicion this game would be awesome on a console with console controls or with a console controller on the PC. But using the keyboard and mouse, I found this quite difficult to play. As you can see from the frame rates there, it's very playable and just fine on any of these, although you can see a substantial jump when we go to 8 true cores instead of 4 cores, 8 threads. So even from the KB Lake to the Coffee Lake Refresh, which really per core and per thread is very similar in performance, notice there's a very large jump because this game is using not just the extra threads, but the extra cores. Just like For Honor, I want to reach through my computer monitor to every game developer on Earth. I want to grab them by the neck, put them in front of Strange Brigade, and say, make your game work like this. This is beautiful. Look at the waterfalls, look at the trees and the vines and the explosions and the stuff going on. Why on earth can game developers not make games that play this well? Why do we need such uber overpowered computers when you have graphics that look at the frame rates. 253 frames per second on an 8-year-old i7 2600K. Gorgeous. What more needs to be said? Listen up, game devs. This is what you should be doing. The Division 2, also from Ubisoft, but not nearly as poorly optimized as, say, Assassin's Creed Odyssey. What is it with Assassin's Creed Odyssey that just makes it run awful no matter what hardware you have? Look at the frame rates here. We're over 200 frames per second on the i7 9700K, but we're still over 120 frames per second on the i7 2600K. Note that just like Ghost Recon Wildlands, I've played this. Now, I have not beaten the Division 2. I've beaten the Division, but I've played through a decent chunk of the Division 2. I can tell you these frame rates don't hold. It's really pretty in the built-in benchmark, and it's great for comparing different systems, but the actual gameplay when you get into intense firefights drops substantially. I can tell you the i7 2600K will not hold 100 frames per second throughout this game. And definitely if you want to get into player versus player, you're going to be closer down to 60 to 75 frames per second on that thing. On the newer machines, it'll hold much, much better. Over 100 frames per second the vast majority of the time. It'll run really, really well, unless, of course, you crank the detail up to 4K. But as you can see, just like my speech with Shadow of the Tomb Raider, our CPU usage is creeping up into the 80 to 90% range at times, and it absolutely does that during live gameplay. 122 to 206. That is a huge performance difference, especially considering that we are not graphics card bottlenecked there. We are CPU bottlenecked. There is legitimately a massive real-world performance difference between these processors. Does that matter to you? Do you still own the old one? Is it worth upgrading? Now, those are subjective questions. But if the question was, is there really a big difference, or is it just like 10% and a bunch of nonsense? I assure you there is a real solid difference between these chips. Then the question is, do you care? Last but certainly not least, World of Tanks. This will be a short benchmark because this game frankly runs gorgeous on any of these machines. What kills World of Tanks is slow cores. If you're running a locked i5 2400, the lack of the 8 threads isn't what's going to kill you. It's the 3 gigahertz locked second generation cores not running at 4.5 gigahertz that will kill you. So that's just something to keep in mind when you're comparing generations, as we're running at 4.5 gigahertz here. 192 to 258, there's no performance issues. Any of these machines would run World of Tanks just fine. Moving on to the non-gaming benchmarks, let's start off with a couple of synthetics. CPU-Z, a free utility you can download, tells you all kinds of cool information about your system, like what motherboard you have, what speed your memory is really running at, and of course it has a built-in benchmark. Notice how close those single-core benchmarks are to each other, yet how far apart the gaming benchmarks are from each other. This just goes to show that pure synthetic performance is not necessarily the reason why these machines are so far apart. The DDR RAM speed, the DMI2 to DMI3, the PCI Express bus differences, the internal cache structure differences. There's a lot of differences that cause these machines to run different in performance that synthetic benchmarks like this don't necessarily show. Of course, the multi-core performance just shows the difference. Threads are not cores. I don't want to yell into the microphone here, but I really want to kill this point so that nobody ever confuses this issue again. 4 cores and 8 threads is not the same as 8 cores and 8 threads. Look at that 4464. That demolishes the other CPUs, and that's because it has 8 true, real, honest-to-goodness processing cores. Extra threads smooth out your performance and make your machine more responsive, and it allows the machine to respond to your input and reduce input lag and multitask better. It doesn't make it any faster. They're not real execution units. And this right here should make that point. Cinebench R20. Now this is an actual test of 3D rendering as opposed to just the synthetics of CPU-Z, and there's a little bit more performance difference. 335 to 432 to 471 to 517. Those are real differences. They're not huge differences, but if you go the entire generation of 8 years, 335 to 517 is not a small jump, and that's part of what you're really seeing because this is actually doing real work. Look at that multi-threaded test. The 3 4-core chips, 1600-ish, 2100-ish, and 2400-ish, all of those are 4-core, 8-thread chips, all running at a fixed 4.5 gigahertz, and yet there is a multi-core performance difference. Part of it's the RAM speed, part of it's the internal cache structure, and just the design of the architecture. But then when you give it 8 real cores, yeah, same thing about the same speech I just gave you about threads are not cores. Almost 4,000 because we have 8 true processing cores on the i7 9700K. File compression, decompression, 7-zip. This is version 19 for those of you curious. Download it, try it yourself on your own machine. Compressing and decompressing are pretty self-explanatory. We're just going to talk about combined because that just averages the two. 31,000 on the i7 2600K to over 60,000 on the i7 9700K. 4 cores, 8 threads from 8 generations ago to 8 cores and 8 threads on the current CPU. That is a serious difference. You can see the small optimizations on the two CPUs in the middle. They do definitely get better. But again, that just shows what real cores do versus hyperthreads, which aren't. That brings us to Blender. This test takes real time to run. It took 45 minutes and 12 seconds to run on the 2600K and only 20 minutes and 29 seconds to run on the 9700K. Just for fun, take a look at the 4790K. It was 10 minutes faster. These are both 4-core, 8-thread processors. They are both running at 4.5 gigahertz. They both have 32 gigs of DDR3 RAM. There is a very slight RAM difference speed. It doesn't matter. 2133 versus 2400 does not account for a 10-minute difference. The real reason for that difference, for those of you curious, are the AVX and other instructions. The second generation and third generation are missing a number of advanced instructions that were added in the Haswell line and later, and that's part of why Haswell does so well here and almost keeps up with the 7700K. And of course, the 9700K has 8 real cores, and so it obviously demolishes the place. But if you're doing Blender, if you're doing 3D rendering, you wouldn't buy any of these or use any of these. If you're serious, no, I'm not talking about somebody who does something once or twice as a hobby. If you make money with this, you're probably already on a high-end desktop platform, so it may not matter. But if you're curious on what a real workload that takes real time to run does, this is it.
There are effectively 2 stories to be told here. Number 1, it's absolutely amazing to somebody like myself who's been around the computer industry for a while that in 2019 you can use an 8-year-old computer to still play all modern games and still run modern applications. It's not as fast. And that's sort of the other half of the story. There has genuinely been a performance improvement. Even putting aside the additional cores in the 9700K, the 7700K is legitimately noticeably faster than the 2600K. You wouldn't have noticed it going up one step at a time, but if you skip 7 or 8 years, then you definitely do notice it. So Intel has been making improvements, but it's nothing like it used to be. If you were growing up in the PC era like I was back in the 80s and the 90s, computer performance was doubling every 18 months. 3 years and your computer was obsolete. Windows 3 to 3.1 to 95 to 98, all throughout the 90s required a computer upgrade. And every 2 to 3 years, if you weren't doing something to your computer, it was obsolete really fast. The idea that in 1999, 20 years ago, you could use a computer from 1991, that was laughable. They weren't even remotely close. They were so far apart, it's just silly to even contemplate the thought. But you can do it today. And to some extent, that's partly because we've kind of gotten good enough in computers. Windows at some point, it runs your programs, it runs your applications, you get a better video card, and it does the job just fine. The other part has been, yes, Intel has not been innovating as fast as they used to. Yes, the year-over-year increments in the 2010s have definitely not been as fast as they were in the past, which has allowed AMD to catch up with Ryzen. Now, you see here the latest CPUs on the desk. i7 9700K, i9 9900K, Ryzen 7 3700X, the new Zen 2, and Ryzen 9 3900X, the new 12-core, 24-thread beast of a CPU. $500 for the bottom ones and about $330 and $360 for the 2 top ones. If you don't want to wait for my next video, buy one of these 3 CPUs. I wouldn't buy an i7 9700K. 8 threads is going to be tremendously limiting in the next few years. You will not get very much future capability. Yes, the reality is the i7 9700K today will play all your games just fine. But even in some, which I didn't show you here because they take far longer to benchmark, Battlefield 5 multiplayer, 64-player online conquest, Call of Duty Black Ops 4, and some other heavily intensive multiplayer online games are already using 100% of an 8-thread CPU, and they'll use 12 if you have them to spare. If you really are building a computer today, right now, if you're going out for a new purchase, 8 cores, 16 threads is where it's at, in my opinion. However, Do not misconstrue that statement to that these 4-core 8-thread machines are, quote, obsolete, trash, and you have to throw them away. There's a world of difference in purchase advice between new purchase today and can you get another couple of years out of your computer. If you have an i7 7700K and it's doing what you want and it's playing the games what you want, don't upgrade, keep it. It's a great processor. As you saw from the performance today, it runs programs great. Certainly, if you have lesser graphics card or you upgrade the resolution, then that'll slow down. But that's graphics performance. What I showed you today is the potential CPU performance if you give it all the graphics card in the world. If you have a mid-range graphics card today and you upgrade to, say, an RTX 4060 in 3 years, that'll be effectively an RTX 2080 or 2080 Ti today for probably $400 in 3 years. Graphics cards are still advancing, unlike CPUs. Well, that might be changing thanks to Ryzen, but at least the way they have been over the past 8 years. So a 7700K is still a great chip. A 4790K is still a viable chip, although I'm kind of on the edge on that one. I mean, certainly if it does what you need, if you don't need to play every latest greatest game, if you've got a mid-range graphics card, if you're happy with it, you can certainly get some more life out of a 4790K. The venerable i7 2600K, there's something these benchmarks don't show you that shows up when you actually use these computers. There is a world of difference that I can describe it, but I can't show it to you in a chart. Sitting down, booting these computers, opening up Chrome tabs, multitasking, watching a YouTube video while playing a game, updating games, running Windows updates, having multiple things going on. The difference in the real world between all those things happening on a 7700K and a 2600K is night and day difference. If you gave these machines to me blind, put them under the desk and I couldn't see them and I had to switch back and forth between them, you could tell the difference. I could tell the difference, and I think most of you could as well. And none of that shows up in a benchmark chart, which is the failing of benchmarks, but it's what we have to work with. So you will just have to take my advice for the fact that I have all of them and I've played with them and I've updated them and I've used them. Would I personally use a 4790K today? Yes, it's actually pretty quick and snappy and responsive, especially with that NVMe drive in there. I was impressed that it really gave it a nice uptick in terms of opening multiple programs and running updates. It's definitely a nice speed boost. A 2600K? No. If you have any means at all, if you have any money at all and any budget at all, a 2600K, in my opinion, is time to upgrade. It's had a great run, 8 years. That is incredible and amazing in the computer industry. But unless you just have no money at all, in which case the point's kind of moot, it really is, in my opinion, time to upgrade. I think if you move from that to a Ryzen 7 3700X or an i9 9900K, don't go to a 7700K. I mean, go to at least an 8-core chip. But if you move from that to one of these modern platforms, I think you're going to have a wow moment. You're going to be, wow, this is more responsive, it's snappier, I can open multiple tabs quicker, everything updates, runs faster, it boots up, it shuts down, everything is just much nicer experience. If you've got the money, do it. 50-50 on the 4790K and 7700K. If it does what you need, keep it, because that's a great modern platform and there's no reason to throw out your money that you spent just a couple of years ago just because the new shiny kids are on the block. But these are amazing, and in the next video, we will definitely be taking a look at these and seeing how well they compete against each other. Thank you all so much for watching this video. Like this video if you like it, share it with your friends if you love it. Remember to subscribe to my channel with a big huge red button directly below. Hit the bell notification icon to actually be notified when the videos come out. Comments in the comment section below, links in the video description below, and I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I will see all of you next time.